washer of their master's clothes, wet nurse or nursery attendant, teacher, secretary, seamstress, accountant, and physician. 4. A large elite household, a domus in town, or a villa in the countryside, might be supported by a staff of hundreds. 46. The living conditions of slaves attached to a domus, the familia urbana, while inferior to those of the free persons they lived with, were sometimes superior to that of many free urban poor in Rome. 47. Household slaves likely enjoyed the highest standard of living among Roman slaves, next to publicly owned slaves, who were not subject to the whims of a single master. 43. Imperial slaves were those attached to the emperor's household, the familia Caesaris. 46. In urban workplaces, the occupations of slaves included fullers, engravers, shoemakers, bakers, mill drivers, and prostitutes. Farm slaves, familia rustica, probably lived in more healthful conditions. Roman agricultural writers expect that the workforce of a farm will be mostly slaves, managed by a villicus, who is often a slave himself. 46. Eros, Posidipus cook. This is Hissite, ser presumably short for service, slave epitaph on Astor. 48. Slaves numbering in the tens of thousands were condemned to work in the mines or quarries, where conditions were notoriously brutal. 46. Damnati in metallum. Those condemned to the mine were convicts who lost their freedom as citizens, libertas, forfeited the property, bono, to the state, and became servi poeni, slaves as a legal penalty. Their status under the law was different from that of other slaves. They could not buy their freedom, be sold, or be set free. They were expected to live and die in the mines. 49. Imperial slaves and freedmen, the familia Caesaris, worked in mine administration and management. 50. In the late Republic, about half the gladiators who fought in Roman arenas were slaves, though the most skilled were often free volunteers. 51. Successful gladiators were occasionally rewarded with freedom. However, gladiators, being trained warriors and having access to weapons, were potentially the most dangerous slaves. At an earlier time, many gladiators had been soldiers taken captive in war. Spartacus, who was a rebel gladiator, led the Great Slave Rebellion of 73-71 BC. Servus Publicus. A servus publicus was a slave owned not by a private individual, but by the Roman people. Public slaves worked in temples and other public buildings both in Rome and in the municipalities. Most perform general, basic tasks as servants to the college of pontiffs, magistrates, and other officials. Some well-qualified public slaves did skilled office work such as accounting and secretarial services. They were permitted to earn money for their personal use. 52. Because they had an opportunity to prove their merit, they could acquire a reputation and influence, and were sometimes deemed eligible for manumission. During the Republic, a public slave could be freed by a magistrate's declaration, with the prior authorization of the Senate. In the imperial era, liberty would be granted by the emperor. Municipal public slaves could be freed by the municipal council. 52. Treatment and legal status. Relief from Smyrna, present-day Izmir, Turkey, depicting a Roman soldier leading captives in chains according to Marcel Mauss. In Roman times the persona gradually became synonymous with the true nature of the individual, but the slave was excluded from it. Servus non habet personam, a slave has no persona. He has no personality. He does not own his body, he has no ancestors, no name, no cognomen, no goods of his own. 53. The testimony of a slave could not be accepted in a court of law. 54. Unless the slave was tortured, a practice based on the belief that slaves in a position to be privy to their master's affairs would be too virtuously loyal to reveal damaging evidence unless coerced. Rome differed from Greek city-states in allowing freed slaves to become citizens. After manumission, a male slave who had belonged to a Roman citizen enjoyed not only passive freedom from ownership, but active political freedom, libertas, including the right to vote. 55. A slave who had acquired libertas was thus a libertas, freed person, feminine liberta, in relation to his former master, who then became his patron, patronus. As a social class, freed slaves were libertini, though later writers used the terms libertas and libertinus interchangeably. 56. 57. Libertini were not entitled to hold public office or state priesthoods, nor could they achieve senatorial rank. During the early empire, however, freedmen held key positions in the government bureaucracy, so much so that Hadrian limited their participation by law. 58. Any future children of a freedman would be born free, with full rights of citizenship. Although in general freed slaves could become citizens, with the right to vote if they were male, those are categorized as dediticii suffered permanent disbarment from citizenship. The dediticii were mainly slaves whose masters had felt compelled to punish them for serious misconduct by placing them in chains, branding them, torturing them to confess a crime, imprisoning them or sending them involuntarily to a gladiatorial school, ludus, or condemning them to fight with gladiators or wild beasts. Dediticii were regarded as a threat to society, regardless of whether their masters' punishments had been justified, and if they came within 100 miles of Rome, they were subject to reenslave. 59. Roman slaves could hold property which, despite the fact that it belonged to their masters, they were allowed to use as if it were their own. 60. Skilled or educated slaves were allowed to earn their own money and might hope to save enough to buy their freedom. 61. 62. Such slaves were often freed by the terms of the master's will, or for services rendered. A notable example of a high-status slave was Tiro, the secretary of Cicero. Tiro was freed before his master's death, and was successful enough to retire on his own country estate, where he died at the age of 99. 63, 64, 65. However, the master could arrange that slaves would only have enough money to buy their freedom when they were too old to work. They could then use the money to buy a new young slave, while the old slave, unable to work, would be forced to rely on charity to stay alive. 66. There was a prohibition on placing a tombstone at a slave's grave, but it was not always obeyed. 67. Several emperors began to grant more rights to slaves as the empire grew. Claudius announced that if a slave was abandoned by his master, he became free. Nero granted slaves the right to complain against their masters in a court. And under Antoninus Pius, a master who killed a slave without just cause could be tried for homicide. 68. Legal protection of slaves continued to grow as the empire expanded. It became common throughout the mid to late 2nd century AD to allow slaves to complain of cruel or unfair treatment by their owners. 69. Attitudes changed in part because of the influence among the educated elite of the Stoics, whose egalitarian views of humanity extended to slaves. There are reports of abuse of slaves by Romans, but there is little information to indicate how widespread such harsh treatment was. Cato the Elder was recorded as expelling his old or sick slaves from his house. Seneca in his letter 47 expressed the view that a slave who was treated well would perform a better job than a poorly treated slave. As most slaves in the Roman world could easily blend into the population if they escaped, it was normal for the masters to discourage slaves from running away by putting a tattoo reading "Stop me. I am a runaway, or tax paid if the slaves were owned by the Roman state on the foreheads of their slaves. 70. For this reason, slaves usually wore headbands to cover up their disfiguring tattoos, and at the temple of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, in Ephesus, archaeologists have found thousands of tablets from escaped slaves asking Asclepius to make the tattoos on their foreheads. Disappear. 71. Crucifixion was the capital punishment meted out specifically to slaves, traitors, and bandits. 72. 73, 74, 75. Marcus Crassus was supposed to have concluded his victory over Spartacus in the Third Servile War by crucifying 6,000 of the slave rebels along the Appian Way. Rebellions and runaways. Moses Finley remarked, "Fugitive slaves are almost an obsession in the sources." Rome forbade the harboring of fugitive slaves, and professional slave catchers were hired to hunt down runaways. Advertisements were posted with precise descriptions of escaped slaves, and offered rewards. 76. If caught, fugitives could be punished by being whipped, burnt with iron, or killed. Those who lived were branded on the forehead with the letters FUG, for fugitivus. Sometimes slaves had a metal collar riveted around the neck. One such collar is preserved at Rome and states in Latin, "I have run away. Catch me. If you take me back to my master Zoninus, you will be rewarded." 43. There was a constant danger of servile insurrection, which had more than once seriously threatened their public. 77. The 1st century BC Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that slaves sometimes banded together to plot revolts. He chronicled the 3 major slave rebellions, in 135–132 BC, the First Servile War, in 104–100 BC, the Second Servile War, and in 73–71 BC, the Third Servile War. 78. Serfdom. In addition to slavery, the Romans also practiced serfdom. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire faced a labor shortage. Large Roman landowners increasingly relied on Roman freemen, acting as tenant farmers, instead of slaves to provide labor. 79. The status of these tenant farmers, eventually known as colony, steadily eroded. Because the tax system implemented by Diocletian assessed taxes based on both land and the inhabitants of that land, it became administratively inconvenient for peasants to leave the land where they were counted in the census. 79. In 332 AD, Emperor Constantine issued legislation that greatly restricted the rights of the colony and tied them to the land. Some see these laws as the beginning of medieval serfdom in Europe. Slavery in philosophy and religion. Classical Roman religion. The religious holiday most famously celebrated by slaves at Rome was the Saturnalia, a December festival of role reversals during which time slaves enjoyed a rich banquet, gambling, free speech and other forms of license not normally available to them. To mark their temporary freedom, they wore the pilus, the cap of freedom, as did free citizens, who normally went about bareheaded. 80. 81. Some ancient sources suggest that master and slave dined together. 82. 83. While others indicate that the slaves feasted first, or that the masters actually served the food. The practice may have varied over time. 84. Macrobius, 5th century AD, describes the occasion thus: meanwhile, the head of the slave household, whose responsibility it was to offer sacrifice to penates, to manage the provisions and to direct the activities of the domestic servants, came to tell his master that the household had feasted according to the annual ritual custom. For at this festival, in houses that keep to proper religious usage, they first of all honor the slaves with a dinner prepared as if for the master, and only afterwards is the table set again for the head of household. So, then, the chief slave came in to announce the time of dinner and to summon the masters to the table. 85. 86. Saturnalian license also permitted slaves to enjoy a pretense of disrespect for their masters, and exempted him from punishment. The Augustan poet Horace calls their freedom of speech December liberty, Libertas Decembri. 87, 88. In two satires set during the Saturnalia, Horace portrays a slave as offering sharp criticism to his master. 89, 90, 91. But everyone knew that the leveling of the social hierarchy was temporary and had limits. No social norms were ultimately threatened, because the holiday would end. 92. Another slave's holiday, Servorum Dies Festus, was held August 13, 93, in honor of Servius Tullius, the legendary sixth king of Rome, who was the child of a slave woman. Like the Saturnalia, the holiday involved a role reversal. The matron of the household washed the heads of her slaves, as well as her own. 94, 95. The temple of Farinaya at Terracina in Latium was the site of special ceremonies pertaining to manumission. The goddess was identified with Libertas, the personification of liberty. 96, and was a tutelary goddess of freedmen, De Libertorum. A stone at her temple was inscribed, "Let deserving slaves sit down so that they may stand up free." 97, 98. Female slaves and religion. At the Matralia, a women's festival held the 11th of June in connection with the goddess Mater Matuta, free women ceremonially beat a slave girl and drove her from the community. Slave women were otherwise forbidden from participation. 99. Slave women were honored at the Ancillarum Feriae on July 7. 100, 101. The holiday is explained as commemorating the service rendered to Rome by a group of ancillae, female slaves or handmaids, during the war with the Fidenades in the late 4th century BC. 102, 103. Weakened by the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC, the Romans next had suffered a stinging defeat by the Fidenades, who demanded that they hand over their wives and virgin daughters as hostages to secure peace. A handmaid named either Philotis or Tucula came up with a plan to deceive the enemy. The ancillae would put on the apparel of free women, spend one night in the enemy camp, and send a signal to the Romans about the most advantageous time to launch a counterattack. 99, 104. Although the historicity of the underlying tale may be doubtful, it indicates that the Romans thought they had already had a significant slave population before the Punic Wars. 105. Dedication to Mithras by the imperial slave Etemetus. A great number of inscriptions from around the empire record votive offerings from slaves and freedmen mystery cults. The Mithraic mysteries were open to slaves and freedmen, and at some cult sites most or all votive offerings are made by slaves, sometimes for the sake of their master's well-being. 106. The cult of Mithras, which valued submission to authority and promotion through a hierarchy, was in harmony with the structure of Roman society, and thus the participation of slaves posed no threat to social order. 107. Stoic philosophy. The Stoics taught that all men were manifestations of the same universal spirit, and thus by nature equal. Stoicism also held that external circumstances, such as being enslaved, did not truly impede a person from practicing the Stoic ideal of inner self-mastery. It has been said that one of the more important Roman Stoics, Epictetus, spent his youth as a slave. Early Christianity. Both the Stoics and some early Christians opposed the ill treatment of slaves, rather than slavery itself. Advocates of these philosophers saw them as ways to live within human societies as they were, rather than to overthrow entrenched institutions. In the Christian scriptures, equal pay and fair treatment of slaves was enjoined upon slave masters, and slaves were advised to obey their earthly masters, even if their masters are unfair, and lawfully obtain freedom if possible. 108, 109, 110. 111, certain senior Christian leaders, such as Gregory of Nyssa and John Chrysostom, called for good treatment for slaves and condemned slavery, while others supported it. Christianity gave slaves an equal place within religion, allowing them to participate in the liturgy. According to tradition, Pope Clement I, term c. 92-99, Pope Pius I, 100